everyone. Welcome to the end of the day. I know this is sometimes a hard time to have as a speaker because people have been around all day. They're a little bit tired, understandably. So first off, thank you all for sticking around through the end of the day. It's been an amazing event with lots of speakers, and I've gotten to check in and watch some of it as well. So excited to be here, and we'll see how weird it gets. And part of that story is maybe a change in title and kind of theme here that I was thinking about in brainstorming on Twitter last night. And so the original title that is listed here is developer experience being the secret behind Astro's success. And that is still wholeheartedly true. But really what this has become is Astro a love story from my perspective. So I'm going to kind of combine two things that I love a lot in the world, and that is developer experience and Astro. And for me personally, I am a developer, speaker, and teacher. And from the developer experience perspective, I've spent about 10 plus years, the majority of my career in developer experience and working with developer products. And now I get to combine that with something I am very excited about, which is Astro. And my personal opinions obviously are going to be the focus of the talk. But I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm not the only one. And maybe some people in the chat can comment whether or not they've used Astro and liked it. You've probably seen Astro in a few different talks, at least throughout this event and other events that you've been to or watched. But I'm not the only one. And I asked on Twitter just to kind of get a feel from people of what they liked about Astro. And I was kind of punny with it. And I said, what do you like about Astro and why is it everything about Astro? And several people commented. Ciora said the docs are otherworldly good. Nai said excellent markdown support. We'll talk about this throughout the talk. Dan Spratling said it's so simple but yet powerful. This is actually, I think, one of the key takeaways with Astro is the simplicity combined with feature set, and the power that comes with that is really incredible. And this one I think is really funny. It's really interesting. Kenneth said Astro is really pretty awesome. And you see that and you assume somebody that comments that has actually used Astro before, but he goes on to say, I haven't really had time to check it out. It's next on my list. I want to, but already knows that it's a good thing. And I think that's because of the hype of Astro. And we'll talk about where the hype comes from, how that evolves, all these things. But there are people out there who have never used Astro that basically already love it and are excited about it. Now, I also not only asked on Twitter, I asked in my Discord. So I run a Discord server called Learn, Build, Teach at learnbuildteach.com. Christoph, who I think is in the chat, actually commented with several different things in here. And he talked about the first time that he was working with Astro, he felt like he was just writing HTML and JavaScript in a simpler way. This is similar feedback to what people have had with things like Svelte. It's similar to my feelings about Svelte, just the simplicity. He mentions content collections, SSR, server-side rendering. He mentions all these things and how excited he is to go forward with Astro as well. And that's really cool. And then we had one more from Jamie or Jaime in our Discord as well. Talks about how we tried to learn React. And let me know, like, hands up or emoji reactions or something in the chat if this is you. Tried to learn React before, and it felt like a lot. It felt overkill. It was tricky, like use effect, all these things. It's like maybe a little bit too much sometimes. And Astro gets away from that, which is really, really cool. And he also mentions in here specifically the idea of static sites, which is something that I want to talk a lot about in this talk as well. So as we go through these comments, as I go through the comments, there's features and things that stick out. There's server-side rendering, there's static site generation, there's working with Markdown, there's content collections, which I think is one of the best features of all frameworks of all time, to be quite honest. There's the not only server-side rendering, but also complete server functionality with API endpoints, and then there's integrations. And there's all these things that are really exciting about Astro. We'll see some specific examples of this as we go through. But also, I think probably the more important takeaway from this is the higher level comments that people have about documentation, about flexibility, about community, their Discord, the response that you get from people on Twitter, other communities as well, the feature set, the evolution of Astro, which I will talk about, and try to tie that to a relationship and dating and getting married, going back to the falling in love story here. And then lastly, the simplicity of Astro as well. And there's a bunch of different words that we can focus on with that, a feature set and like characteristics and all these things about Astro. But the number one takeaway for me, coming from years of experience in developer relations experience and working with developer products, is Astro is a product now at this point whose customers or their users have become their advocates. And if you've ever worked with a product of any sort, if you've ever kind of been around the idea of trying to get people to take hold of something, you know that this is the ultimate dream. This is absolutely, let me stop this for like not too much mobility here. This is the absolute dream for anybody that's creating a developer product, is for other people to go out and share their story. If I work for a company and I tell you my company is awesome, you might believe me, you might not. You may take that with a grain of salt. But when you see people posting about it and sharing their excitement, that's where you actually earn credibility. And that's where it actually means more, I think, to the developer community. And if you pay attention, whether you've not seen it before, you have noticed it before, but if you pay attention going forward, the things you hear, the things you see people say about Astro are basically all positive. I challenge you all to go search Twitter and try to find a negative comment about Astro. I actually have one negative thing that I will share at the end of this, and I have one negative thing, kind of negative, from a community member on Twitter. But I would love to actually see if you find something negative on Twitter, send me a tweet and share that, because I have seen basically nothing negative. And if you think of other major frameworks, there's ups and downs, right? People agree or disagree. They like certain features, they don't like certain features, etc. So I challenge you, go and find something negative about Astro. And while you're doing this, I'll give you a chance in case you want to scan this. You'll have a link to the slides at the end of this as well. So don't worry if you don't get to this in the next couple of seconds. But I will walk through a couple of code snippets. And these are going to be code snippets that come from my Astro course. Now I'll talk about my course. It's a paid thing, but this is what I'm sharing now is free, like code that you can go check out and do whatever you want with. So if you wanted to go see the code behind the scenes, you can absolutely go do that. So this is where we maybe get a little weird. And I'm going to go into this like dating idea. And I'm going to go into the first impression with dating. And I want to relate this back to the ecosystem that we live in. I'm a JavaScript person. I do a lot of JavaScript. I do JavaScript everything. There's a ton of JavaScript that's been covered in this talk, or not in this talk, but in this conference as a whole. And the JavaScript ecosystem, if you've been a part of it for any amount of time, you know how distracting it is to be a part of. And this is basically what it's like. You have someone who's attached to a framework. They see the hot new framework walk by. They turn their heads because they just can't help themselves, because they're so excited for something new, something different, etc. And that basically happens every day. Now, I do want to be clear. I love Astro. I also really love Next.js. So this is not a shot at Next.js. This is just meant to be a framework and kind of the way we respond to new frameworks as they come out. But the developer minds are so easily distracted by everything that comes by. And what that means is that first impression is made within seconds of people experiencing your product in some ways. You only have a few seconds to make that first impression to either get someone that's interested in using your product, or they move on and keep going about their life. And now I've never used Tinder per se, or actually it's not per se. I've never actually used it because I've been in a relationship longer since before Tinder. That sounded weird, but it basically feels like you're playing Tinder with frameworks, right? Like people, they see a tweet and they see a new topic, or they read a blog post, or they listen to a podcast and they see this new topic. And within seconds, in their mind, they're swiping left or right. I don't actually know which one is the good one. I think it's right. I've got the green thing on the right here. But they're swiping left and right on these frameworks basically every day because there's so many options and it's so easy to get distracted. So I want to share, like, for me, my first impression of Astro came from the source of all first impressions, and that is Twitter. Now, I kind of commented on Twitter earlier about working from home and how much time I spend scrolling Twitter, and a lot of it is productive because of how much I take away from Twitter. Some of it is a waste, whatever. But my first impression of Astro came from Twitter, and what I saw about 2 years ago was my comments being flooded with people saying things similar to this. This is a more recent comment, but at the time, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, my comments were flooded with people saying, I moved over to Astro and I absolutely loved it. I moved over to Astro and it was the easiest thing I've ever done. I moved over to Astro and it was exactly what I wanted. There's no better situation to be in from a product perspective than for people to be able to share your stuff online in that capacity. Now, this to me focuses in on the power of social media. Again, we talked about at the beginning, the dream of a developer product is your users, your customers go out there and they advocate for you. And for better or for worse, social media is one of the places that we do that most. So Astro caught my eye. I had this positive first impression with Astro, and I I said, Astro, I haven't done this in a while, but I said, Astro, I would like to go on a date with you. I would like to try this out. I want to see what it's like to actually spend 2 hours with you, just me and you, upstairs in the office, and see how it goes. And if we think back to dating, it's been a little while for me, to be honest. I've been married now for 8 years, in a relationship for 10 plus. Think back to dating, that first date really says it all. It really says a lot. And I'm not saying like instantly whether or not you're going to marry the person or anything like that. I'm just saying you get kind of a yes or no whether this is worth investing more time in, or whether you're curious to invest more time in after 30 minutes. At 30 minutes, you probably have a good idea if this is a person, or in this case, a technology that you're interested in spending more time with. And if we translate that to a technical perspective, to a DevRel perspective, to a developer experience perspective, what that means is your onboarding experience must be absolutely amazing. Because we talked about how hard it is to get that first impression within seconds. But then when people actually move past the impression to actually trying your product, the onboarding for them has to be absolutely incredible. And this reminds me of the words of one of my favorite rappers of all time, Eminem. And Eminem says that you only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. You better lose yourself. And I think this stands so true for developer experience and that onboarding experience. You have one shot to nail that experience, to keep that user engaged and wanting to do more with your product. Because the worst thing you want to happen is someone uses your product and they walk away saying, I don't know what to do next. They don't know where to go next, or they don't know how to solve the specific problem that they're looking to solve. They can't find the resources, they can't find the documentation, whatever. They just don't know what to do next. That's the absolute worst case that you can be in, I think, from a developer product standpoint. And I see this happen a lot. And I do some consulting with developer products. I've worked in developer experience. I've worked with companies on doing content creation. And I see this a lot where I think companies are just trying to do too much. They're trying to look at what they should be for another person or for a user, everything that they could possibly want, and trying to do too much. And this kind of reminds me of, I think I have this story right. I might be a little off, to be honest, but I'm going to go with it and just pretend that it's correct. My sister, when she was dating her boyfriend at the time, now husband, my brother-in-law, who I love, we're all super close. My sister was big into rap music. I grew up listening to rap music. My brother-in-law, Paul, is an absolute snob. He's very particular about the music he listens to. He's an artist, if that gives you any like indication of like his snobbiness for art and music, etc. And I remember my sister telling me that Paul said he didn't like rap music. And I remember my sister at least joking that she said, "Oh, me neither. Like I don't like it either." Because she was trying to be the person that she thought he wanted her to be. And I see that happen again with products, of just trying to do too much, or trying to be things that they think developers want without really understanding what developers want, and not being true to themselves as a product, not just being you. I think that's the cliche advice if we're going on a first date and we're nervous or whatever, and people are like, just be yourself, you're awesome. Well, I think Astro as a framework was very comfortable early on of knowing who they were. And I want to elaborate a little bit on that by showing you how they describe themselves now. And now you can kind of read on here, but they advertise them as being a web framework for content-driven websites. And if you go dig a little deeper, they talk about building fast websites, client-side web apps, dynamic APIs, and everything in between. And you start to see at this point a little bit of a risk of, hey, we can do everything that you might need as a framework. That seems a little bit risky when I read this in isolation. But this is how Astro defines themselves now, not how they earn their reputation in the developer community. And if you know one thing about Astro, you probably think about Astro as being static first. You think about Astro as being a static site generator. And I'm the first one in every conversation to stand up and raise my hand and say, Astro can do so much more, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Astro can do almost anything that major frameworks like Next.js and SvelteKit, et cetera, can do. Almost all those things they can do. It's so powerful. It's so flexible. It's so simple. But the thing that people knew Astro for, the reason people tried Astro, the reason people experienced Astro for the first time, 99% of the time, was for static first. And they knew that and they embraced that and they were comfortable with who they were and still are. And in my mind, they have the best static first experience I've ever used. I've tried a bunch of different frameworks. I've taught courses, I've done YouTube videos, I've done all these things, but Astro for a static first experience is by far the best experience I've ever had. And to do that, you have to nail a few things, right? Like if you're building a content-driven static site, you have to do a few things, and these aren't really a surprise. You have to be able to work with Markdown. Now, how you work with Markdown, there's different ways you could do it. There's benefits and trade-offs and niceties that you can add. You have to then be able to query that data somehow. You have to display it on a page. Then you have to have within the framework the ability to create static pages. So maybe a static page for a blog listing, like here's all the blog posts, and then dynamic routes that end up being static pages based on each individual blog post where people can see the content. So those are basically the three things you have to be able to really nail, actually not even nail the experience, but at a minimal have that experience available for people. And Astro has nailed this. So let's start with working with Markdown. Astro loves Markdown. Astro treats Markdown as a first-class citizen. And this is straight from their docs, the file-based routing. And I think this is one of the things early on that I experienced and I saw, and I was like, whoa, that's a little different. Astro treats Markdown as a first-class citizen to the point where you can put a Markdown file inside of a pages directory with automatic page-based or file-based routing, and it will render that Markdown as HTML for that page route. No questions asked, no additional work necessary. Now that's some respect. That's some effort. That's some intentional effort of making sure, prioritizing the fact that Markdown or MDX, where developers love to spend their time, love to own their own content, that is a first-class citizen. That was a unique feature and a different thing for me. Now, not only do they offer that, they have this experience for front matter. Now, this is not unique for Markdown. This is a fairly standard thing across any framework basically that you would use. So they have what you would be used to in terms of an editing experience or front matter experience, etc. But they take it one step further and they give you a standard way to organize your Markdown. Now, if you don't want to do this, you can bypass this completely. But Astro has, again, what I think is one of the best framework features of all time, which is content collections. And in this case, content collections allows you to have a content directory inside of your source directory, and then have folders for the different types of content that you might want. So you might have newsletters, blog, authors. I have a section on my site in my source code for talks that I've given, etc. And you store your Markdown files in there. You can also do JSON files, which is pretty cool. And it already has the structure for you and tools around it to support that. So if we go on to the next section, which is to be able to query and display data, the thing that makes Astro so special with content collections is having the queryability, having the ability to query your content just with a function call in JavaScript, like we're used to. And if we look at an example of this, we have a get collection function, again, getting a content collection. And you tell it which collection you want. And in this case, post is how I define blog post, the folder that it's in inside of my source code. So that post keyword matches the folder that it's in my source code. And so we query these posts. We can then do anything with those that we want. It's just an array. So we could slice and get the first 6 of these to display on the home page and then have pagination or something like that. And then from the post, we can pass that into a post list component and be able to display that on our page. So we have not only Markdown being a first-class citizen, we have content collections for organization, and we also have, with content collections, the queryability. I'm making up words on the fly to be able to get your content as easy as possible. Now, for reference, when I ended up migrating to Astro, I had already been working on leveraging Next.js for my blog posts. And I was having to write a bunch of custom code to be able to query Markdown, to parse Markdown, to pull in this package and that package, etc. Astro just worked. And there's no better compliment for a developer product than for a developer to come on board, to know what their use case is, to implement that use case, and to say it just worked. There's no better compliment than that. Now, there's one additional piece in the querying and displaying, and that's the ability to actually create static pages for each of your pages. So we have a get static path. This is almost exactly the same as Next.js. So it's an API that people are familiar with. You query your collections, you convert that into a list of paths by the slug property, and then we can pass that in as a prop to this component and then be able to display this component. Now, at this point in another framework without so much support around it, you may have to get a markdown parsing package to be able to convert the markdown to HTML and display it, etc. This is a built-in thing with Astro, where from your posts, they have a render function which returns an object that inside of it has a content property. That content is a component that is basically the HTML representation of your content. Now, they also give you back headings, for example, so like all of your heading tags in case you wanted to do a table of contents or something like that. So there's tons of niceties around this, but they have all this stuff basically just built in. And that again leads me back to why I think that Astro provides the best static first experience I have ever seen, hands down. Now, if we think about going back to the relationship, we've gotten our first impression, we're dating, we're enjoying it, we spent some time, we want to go on more dates, and now we're starting to fall in love. We like what we're seeing, and we're starting to dig a little bit deeper into Astro. And so one of the things that I always like to call out is Astro integrations. And I don't know why other frameworks don't include this, but for the things that you're going to do on a regular basis, Astro has integrations to do that thing. It seems very simple. Some haven't, like Gatsby had a plugin ecosystem. Next.js doesn't really have this. They just have NPM packages, but I can run an npx astro add command to add any of these integrations, including Tailwind, which I'm a big fan of Tailwind. You can let me know your preference in the chat. Sometimes it's a mixed bag, but there's a lot of people that love Tailwind. Maybe to a detrimental point, and I'll list the one negative comment I've seen about Astro, and it's from my friend Chris Mars. And Chris said that he couldn't find any templates in Astro that didn't use Tailwind for styling, and that's because he's a purist of CSS. He would write his own CSS, and he doesn't use Tailwind. So that's the one kind of negative thing, honestly, that I've really ever seen with Astro. But for people who like Tailwind, who want to add it to their projects, it's a one command, and then there's all the other integrations that you can add as well. Now, Astro, it wouldn't be fair to talk about Astro without talking about its ability to leverage UI frameworks. And I remember Cassidy Williams shared this in my Discord at one point, a presentation on Astro. And I was like, why would you ever want to use React inside of this thing? Why would you ever want to mix React and Vue and Svelte, etc.? But it's really beautiful that Astro adds a bunch of things, the niceties that we've talked about with a static first experience. But if you want to add JavaScript, they enable you to do that with the frameworks that you already have experience in. So my personal preference is Svelte. That's my favorite like UI framework. And so I bring Svelte into Astro anytime I need to add something dynamic, but to have that flexibility and be able to leverage your existing knowledge base is really pretty powerful. Now, I've mentioned that content collections are basically my favorite feature of any framework of all time. And I want to take one step further as to why that is. And it's because of TypeScript, and specifically getting TypeScript types from leveraging Zod to define your content collection schemas. And so what this looks like is for your content directory, you can add a config file and you can import Z for Zod, and then the define collection function. And you can define a collection with TypeScript types using Zod so that you have IntelliSense in your editing experience in Markdown, and then also IntelliSense and TypeScript types associated with your post content as you pull it down. Now, I'd have to go back like 10 slides, but if you noticed, there was a TypeScript type that I referenced when I imported or defined a post as a property to a component that comes from this. And this is, combined with what I've already said, is like the game-changing feature for me. Now, the other thing that I think the next evolution of Astro is leveraging the fact that it has full SSR capabilities. You can do endpoints, you can add auth, you can do protected pages, you can talk to a database and have secure API key references, and all these things you can do inside of Astro. And that, when I realized all the niceties that it had to solve that static first experience, and then realized I could fill any other gaps that I had with leveraging server-side capabilities, I didn't have any other choice. I got down on one knee, I got a ring, and I asked Astro to marry me because this was the framework that could do it all. It has some things to catch up on in terms of comparing to Next.js and other frameworks like that, but everything that it will do in the future, every capability that it adds in the future, I know will be top notch because of the trust that it has earned from me by making such an incredible experience with what their core feature set was to start, which is targeting static sites. I see a comment about Gatsby sheds a tear. I know. So thinking about marriage, I've been married now for 8 years. This is my wife, Jess, who works at Auth0/Okta. And I think about, how much we've changed and evolved in 8 years and 10, 11 years of relationship. And one of the big evolutions that we've gone through, changes, is having our daughter, who is now 8 months old. And so I think about marriage as being an opportunity to see people evolve. And you get to see people through thick and thin. You get to see how you respond to things. You get to see how you change. You get to see how you evolve and how you respond to stuff. And Astro has nailed evolution, maybe a little too much. So back in a year ago, almost exactly, they released Astro 2.0 with a few features. When I was working on releasing my Astro course in August this past year, I found out that they were releasing a brand new version in 3.0 with some additional features. And then after I felt comfortable shipping my course, a couple months later, Astro released 4.0 with additional capabilities. And my only negative thing to say about Astro is that they add too many good features too fast, especially from a course creator perspective. But one of the things that I think is the biggest game changer for Astro going forward that was announced in 4.0 is the Astro Dev toolbar. And this is a toolbar in a locally running site that allows other platforms, other products to develop platform Astro-specific integrations into this toolbar. And I want to give one quick shout out to, I'm partnering with Century on some build and public stuff, and I want to give a shout out to their Spotlight integration with the Astro Dev toolbar, which gives you full stack errors and tracing in your applications, like full stack from front end to back end to your database calls as well. And I think that's been a game changer, and it's one of the first true integrations into the developer toolbar in Astro. It's pretty neat. And as I wrap up, I have a few extra shout outs that I want to give people. I didn't actually mean to leave the rings on here. So these are not marriage proposals. These are just shout outs. But Agility CMS, who I think Joel has already, Joel presented earlier. Agility CMS is recognizing that Astro is a place that they need to be. It's a place where they want to meet developers where they are. Enough developers are doing Astro and talking about it that they are now, they have a wait list for their Astro SDK. So if you want to check that out, agilitycms.com/astro-SDK. I also want to give a shout out to learnastro.dev, which is a course by Chris Pennington. That is a premium interactive course for building modern websites with Astro. There is also the Astro Weekly newsletter, which I follow and love to read every week because every week there's a new something with Astro that's really amazing. So astroweekly.dev. And then lastly, I try to promote others before I promote myself. I have my own course on Astro as well. This has been updated in the last month for Astro 4.0, and this is at astrocourse.dev. And I have a coupon code if people are interested for 25% off. Coupon code is the JamDev 2024, and that expires in a week, I believe. So if you're interested in that, you can go check that out as well. Lastly, if you're looking for more places to find me, I co-host a podcast called Compressed FM. I run a Discord called Learn, Build, Teach, and I'm James Q. Quick on YouTube and Twitter. And lastly, I just want to thank you all for being here and listening to the end of the day. And I'll leave this QR code up for a minute for you to find the slides and any other resources that you might want. But thank you all.
All right, thanks, James. That was amazing. As usual, we have a bunch of great questions from the audience. If you have more, add them into or click the Q&A icon on the right side of your screen. Add them there, and I'll pick them up. I have a handful of questions as well, but we're going to start with one from the audience. This comes from Christoph. Question is, what feature or integration do you think is missing, and what do you wish to see in the next versions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing when I compare Astro to something like Next.js or something like SvelteKit is the amount of time that they've been able to put towards the server. And we look at Astro as starting with static first, and in my mind, having the best experience for static first, and how they've acknowledged, hey, we need more than that. We need more capability, more functionality for developers. So we go to the server side. And my bet is everything that they do, every feature that they add is going to be top notch because of what I've seen in regards to their developer experience. So the next evolution, I think, of Astro for me is continuing to add some of those deeper feature sets and use cases on the server, things that Next.js and SvelteKit, for example, have been doing for longer. But again, when I think Astro is continuing to add those features, I think those features are going to be top notch. So I think it's just deeper capabilities on the server.
Yeah, is there one in particular that you're itching to get, or yeah, like any specific example there? Or you just think it's more like it's focused in that area?
Yeah. No, I like being put on the spot. I don't have anything in particular. Everything that I have wanted to need, actually, I'll have one in a second. Everything I've wanted and needed for things that I built has basically been there. There is one, now that I think about it a little bit, a standardized or kind of agreed upon auth situation. So in my course, we build auth from scratch where we just do a basic login cookie. That's all we do. It's very simple and it's just you're logged in or you're not. And typically what I would do is reach for a auth framework and use that because they can do a lot more things and I don't build auth from scratch very often. So I think that is one thing in particular that I would love to see on Astro is there being a package for Astro specifically for authentication and Astro being behind that and acknowledging that it's supported, it works well, and it does all the things that it should.
I 100% agree with that. I'm working on a project right now in Astro, and it's much more of a robust web application, and I love that I can use Astro for it. But I mean, I feel like this has happened to me a few times in these Jamstack years. Like authentication is so
Yeah.
complicated that I
Yeah.
often reach for some third-party service, but even using those tends to be really complex. So I did the same thing. I rolled my own. It's more of a passwordless system, and
Nice.
it took a whole week of writing code to actually get that thing to work. So yeah, I would love to see that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. And I imagine that's not too far away, to be honest. There's I forget what the name of the package is. It's changed. It was Next Auth originally, and I think it's become like more
Oh,
framework agnostic. Yeah.
yep.
So I imagine this is just me guessing that will be on the Astro side at some point.
I could see that for sure. For sure. Okay, so you got married to Astro. Does that mean that yes, have you solemnly swore you're in this relationship? Does it mean that you don't ever use another framework now? Do you go to it every time? Is there some specific scenario or
Yeah.
example when you feel like, oh, maybe it's not the best choice
Yeah.
for this particular project?
Yeah. And I have to be careful about the implications of saying I'm married to Astro and then like using another frame because it in no way means I don't use other frameworks. I mentioned earlier, I love Next.js. I use Next.js for a couple of projects that I'm working on as well. Some of the reason for that is things we've already talked about, right? Like we talked about authentication. There's also, I was really interested to try out the new app directory in Next.js. I was interested to get into server components. I was interested to get into server actions. And I think those are some of the things that you're saying across multiple frameworks, at least similar capability sets across Remix and Next.js and SvelteKit, et cetera, that Astro just hasn't gotten to that level of attention to yet. Like they haven't been able to build out those things as deeply. And so I think about if I'm building a bigger, more intensive, less content-driven site, I am still probably more drawn to Next.js for several reasons. The amount of resources that are out there, the amount of people using Next.js, the amount of React packages that are out there, although you can also use React inside of Astro, so that's another conversation. But for those reasons, I would often use Next.js. But
That
to
makes
be
sense.
clear, that does not mean that I believe in, for me personally, I'm monogamous marriage.
Fair,
Just to...
fair. Okay, so yeah, and speaking of those component frameworks, you mentioned that you use Svelte. That's kind of your
Mhm.
go. Hey, I need some interactivity. Cool. I'm going to drop a Svelte component in there. And so I have kind of a two-part question. One is, would you use Svelte or one of the other component frameworks when you don't need interactivity? And part two
Mm.
is there a reason you use one of those frameworks versus using Astro components and then just adding the interactive vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah. So if I don't need interactivity, then I haven't, for me, found a reason to add a framework or UI framework. I haven't found a reason to do that without needing specifically to run JavaScript on the browser. And if we didn't make this clear earlier, Astro doesn't send JavaScript to the browser by default. You can use script tags in your Astro components. Talk about that in a second. Or you could use a UI framework, but you also still have to specifically tell it, I do want it to load this JavaScript on the browser. So I do everything inside of regular Astro components that I can. And then if I need something on the front end, I've usually incorporated Svelte. And the other question was, why not use vanilla JavaScript? And I could, but this is my personal opinion. This is like people disagree with it, and that's totally fine. Whatever works for people is what I stand by. I don't think I don't have a reason to ever build anything with vanilla JavaScript when I could use something like Svelte or a framework. Now, do you pay attention to performance and how much JavaScript you're loading to the browser? Absolutely. But it's so much easier, specifically with Svelte. React, there's like other things involved to set up something like relatively basic, but specifically with Svelte, it's so simplistic and it just works with how I think and what I would want to do, that I would bring in Svelte over doing vanilla JavaScript unless it's just something really small that I can just throw it in there with a couple of lines of code. I'd rather stay with my experience in a framework and let the framework do what it does.
Yeah, I actually tend to follow a similar approach, and I think that the key or the important thing in there is you got to still pay attention to performance, and
Yeah.
you say, okay, am I willing to pay those performance implications for the
Yeah.
benefit of having this like significantly lower barrier to writing
Yeah.
interactive code, essentially?
Yeah. And that conversation is for people that are very opinionated about every kilobyte of JavaScript that you send to the browser. Totally with you. I think the thing that we also have to pay attention to is just being realistic. Like I'm not working on super high performant requirements for anything that I build. So for the most part, that just doesn't matter to me. And until I prove that it does matter, I don't have any reason to like make any over optimizations and not leverage the framework for what it is. But again, like I don't work on super high level production software. So people that do have opinions about that because they've experienced, I totally get it.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so this next point you touched on a bit because you talked about how it actually only took a year to go from version 2 to version 4. But earlier in the talk, what I was thinking about was you you're telling this dating story, and that first impression is so important, and I totally agree. But someone who's going to have the first impression at version 4.2, it's a different first impression than those early days. And those early
Yeah.
days were when we were all talking about Next.js and nobody seemed to hate React yet at that point. And so and I'm not sure how close you were in the earlier days with the framework, but if you were, I'm just curious to know, was there anything you felt like the Astro team, community, et cetera, did in those really early days to also make a really good first impression, which was very different than the impression that you might get today?
Yeah. I don't know. I remember somebody mentioned Gatsby in the chat, and this was the same experience that I went through with Gatsby, where 4 years ago or however long ago it was, people on Twitter every day, someone commented, "Just migrated my site to Gatsby. How amazing is this? Static pages, blah blah blah." And I did that. I followed after like hearing 50 people talk about how amazing it was. I went and did that, and that was the exact same experience with Astro. And I really I didn't know Astro intimately at the time. Like I just knew what people talked about it. And again, I think that goes back to the impact, two things of like social media can have, but also making that experience for the people who did try it first so good that they had to share about it. Because it would be different, right? Like if you migrated your blog and you struggled with it and you got there, you're probably not sharing how excited you are. You're probably like, okay, I'm finally done, and it's not worth me talking about anymore. So having made that experience so good for those people early on obviously was key. I think the one other thing, and you kind of alluded to like what is the experience for people today at 4.2. I showed the kind of the screenshot of how they describe themselves, and it mentions doing a lot now. I think that the use case still starts with I'm going to create my blog in Astro because I see that it's an option I should be looking at. I think that's still the onboarding. I think that's still the hook for people right now. And so it seems like a similar progression of you get somebody to try out doing their blog, and then they're like, holy crap, I can do all these other things. And the experience around that is also really good. So I think the biggest thing for me at this point is Astro has added a lot. It's never taken away. And this is not a shot at Next.js, but Next.js has made decisions of having to go from get server side props and get static side or get static props to now going React server components, app router, server actions. They're in a completely different world. And I think it's for like, obviously they think it's for the best. I think it's the way that they see the future being for them, and that's great. But that also means there's some like stumbling blocks for people as they onboard now, because now is totally different. But onboarding now for Astro for that beginner use case or starter use case with building a blog is as good as it was a couple of years ago.
Yes, and that's a great segue to what it's the portion of Astro that you might love the most, and that I feel like I've struggled with getting there, because to kind of set the stage, there's if we make the Venn diagram sort of thing, there's Next.js and their approach over here, and then there are static site generators, maybe more like 11D over here, where you can get up and running with just a file, but it's because that works because it is so opinionated about how you handle content. And then Next.js over here is like, you do whatever you want
you
to
do whatever,
content.
yeah.
And so my struggle personally has been that I feel like the deeper I get into building a content system within a framework that has opinions about that, the more difficult it is to pull that out when I inevitably chase something new for fun, in a couple of years or so.
Yeah.
And I, on a recent project, I have started to use the content mechanism in Astro, and I am feeling the power of it. I feel some limitations in there for sure, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, is there anything specific to the way that they have designed that content system that doesn't make you worry? Maybe it doesn't make you worry about getting locked in, or it makes you enjoy the experience a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the not being worried comes from the fact that fundamentally the core of what you need to have embedded markdown stays the same across frameworks. You have to have markdown files, you have front matter, and you have that stuff in some directory that you can query somehow. So the things that differ is like folder structure. Maybe you put it in a different folder, you organize them differently or something like that. So that could be different, but that's just moving files around. You could write a script to like convert from like one folder to another or something. And then there's the how you query it part, I think is huge. So if you look at what you have to do, or what I was going through having to do in Next.js, was figure out how to use like file system to go and grab all my markdown files and use this other package to convert to HTML or whatever, and then get something else for syntax highlighting, etc. If I wanted to go from Astro to Next.js, those things don't change, but it's not because Astro made it any more difficult. It's because Astro made it easier. So I still have to have the markdown files. I still have to have the content. I may do a different folder structure. I still have to have blah, blah, blah. That doesn't change. Astro just made it easier than it would be if I were to do this in Next.js at this point. So the transferability, I'm not worried about at all. There's nothing about what I'm able to take advantage of with Astro that I can think of that makes it any more difficult to go to another framework than it would be if I was just starting from scratch with that framework in Markdown. Does that make sense?
For sure, for sure. Yeah, and most of my challenge has been that when it's usually when I have to decorate or transform content, and then a lot of that logic ends up in the template, and so then it becomes specific to the framework. But that's also that's going really deep, and we don't need to go there.
Well, there's also maybe one other piece of that is just first class support for MDX as well. So if you're using like, assuming you go to a React based framework, you could still leverage MDX and basically React components in your Markdown on another framework as well that could take care of some of those custom use cases.
For sure. And I think those those features like syntax highlighting are huge, where that's not necessarily something that needs to be part of your content mechanism anyways. But when you're going to add it to a site, any other site that doesn't have that feature, then you're ready to build this blog out, and it seems like, well, that should be super simple, but then you need to find the right package and the right theme and all of that. So yeah, I actually did that last week, and I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, we got to wrap up. So one more question I wanted to ask you was kind of more about the community, because we're this Jam Dev conference was born out of a Jamstack community, and we talked a little bit yesterday about how we don't really have that community anymore, or maybe we do. And so what's definitely clear as we have moved on to having more like framework focused communities, and so there is the social aspect of promotion around Astro. But I'm curious, since you've been in their Discord a bit, and I've had a great experience in that Discord. I wonder if you could talk just for a minute about if there anything particularly unique or just like specifically great about what they're doing with their Discord community.
Yeah. This is gonna sound bougie. I get, like, I don't know what the word for it is, but I have a private channel that is not open to the public in Discord, like with Astro members. And that started with me working on the course. So I had kind of a backdoor to get access to asking questions and things. So I haven't spent time in the broader open community as a whole. But I will say, for the experience that I've had, I get people that are answering questions quickly. I get links to documentations. I get answers to why things aren't working. Just the other day, I don't know if people know this, but Astro actually has streaming built in. So we talk about like React server components and streaming. It's slightly different in the way it works, but Astro does that kind of by default when you query asynchronous data on the server in a nested component. And I was pretty sure that was the case, but I wasn't quite seeing what I thought I would see in like the network tab and stuff. So I was asking them like, hey, shouldn't it do this? Like, I don't see what I think I'm supposed to. And we kind of went back and forth and had some ideas, and finally figured out like, yeah, you're just not going to see it in the place that you're looking for. And then it got down to like a more technical discussion of like, this is why, this is kind of this is how the browser works and handles that request and keeps that stream open, etc. So I can say, again, a little biased and whatever for having like the kind of backdoor channel, but that's been super helpful for me. Anytime I've had a question, it's one, responsive, but also from a technical perspective, which I think is sometimes hard to get in other places where you get a surface level answer. And for me, I'm always the kind of person who, like, I want to know why. I don't just want to move past the problem. I want to know the technical part. And they've done a really good job of doing that. So I think that's been huge. I guess the one other thing they do is they have, and a lot of Discords do this, is they have events where they keep people engaged. And I think that's huge. And that's something that I try to do in my Discord server. And it's a challenge to keep people coming back, to stay engaged and be a part of the community. And it seems like that has worked really well for them to continue to do events and announcements and that sort of stuff.
Amazing.